he ran for office in Boundary County, Idaho, on the platform of enforcing only the laws that people wanted enforced, which is a strategy from Posse Comitatus, which is another.
Whereas Waco, that wasn't so much. The people holed up in Waco weren't so much connected with the movement. They were just religious zealots. But that became a big cause because it was seen as an abuse of government authority.
Yeah, in both cases. So I should also say, Randy Weaver, it wasn't tax evasion. It was entrapment not entrapment, but they were trying to turn him into an ATF informant by getting him to sell a shotgun that was 1/4 of an inch too short.
Okay.
Yeah.
So wait, they had him on an obscure weapons charge and wanted to use that to turn him into a.
Well, then he refused to come to his court date.
Okay, I thought wasn't there a tax issue. It doesn't really matter, but I thought there was no tax thing.
I think that was one of the Montana ones later.
Yeah. Okay. So anyway, these things became. I interrupted you, but I just wanted to establish for people who might not know what Ruby Ridge and Waco meant, but those became big causes.
Yeah, and I think it's, those events are important too, because if you think about multiple kinds of paramilitarism in American society, those events are where we see the rising arc of white power activism on the one hand and the rising arc of paramilitary policing on the other hand kind of collide with each other. And, it's Waco and Ruby Ridge were not the first time that police had used militarized weapons and tactics on American citizens, but they were notable in that they were used on white American citizens and on the evening news. Particularly, Waco was covered for, I think, 51 days. And the end of that siege was like the compound caught on fire, children died. It was a huge, it was an enormous tragedy and a huge PR crisis.
Okay, so these things were kind of helping to sustain maybe the fervor of the movement to some extent. Yeah. But then in 95, the bombing, the McVeigh bombing happens. And here we have another kind of connection to the military. He was a veteran. Among his supposed, this was not a stated grievance, but he had done, I think, fine as a soldier in the Persian Gulf War, but he had tried to get into special forces and he had washed out. He hadn't made it. But anyway, he's another case where you see a relevant connection between war and white power. I mean, he had some of the ideology going into the war, but he was kind of more militant in the aftermath.
Yeah, and there's sort of an archival trace of McVeigh becoming more and more involved in this movement. He had ties with different sort of high-profile leaders of both white power and militia groups. He had traveled to Elohim City, which was a white power compound that had also sheltered members of the order who were on the run. He had received Klan newspapers and written to his sister about different white power ideas. He carried and distributed the Turner Diaries. And I think most persuasively is sort of the information about the target. So the Murrah building in Oklahoma City had been in the crosshairs of this movement since 1983, partly because the building's design made it easy to attack, they thought, but partly because the way that this movement worked was I like what you said earlier about memes. There was sort of a meme about the Murrah building that went from group to group. So when McVeigh stayed with Terry and James Nichols, who were in the Michigan militia.
And he had known Terry in the Army, right?
That's right. James could draw the Murrah building. I believe James, one of the Nichols brothers, could draw the Murrah building by memory, could diagram it by memory, freehand on a piece of paper. They had been thinking so much about this building. Another group called the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord, which was a paramilitary white power compound in Arkansas, Missouri, had attempted to blow it up with a shoulder-mounted missile in 1983, and it hadn't worked for a variety of reasons. But there had been attempts on this building before. And for the bombing date, McVeigh chose not only the anniversary of Waco, but also the execution date of one of the people in the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord who was scheduled for execution that same day, and who watched the coverage of the bombing laughing as he was put to death by the state.
Okay.
So there's sort of a complicated social interface that shows us that McVeigh was not, I mean, what is it to act alone anyway? But he was not acting alone. The other piece of information we have is a strategy called leaderless resistance that was introduced by Beam popularized by Beam in 1983-84, along with the early computer networks. And the idea was that cells would be able to operate without direct communication from white power leadership. That strategy was designed to do two very important things. One was it was designed to foil undercover informants because the Klan and the civil rights era had become very, very frustrated by the presence of FBI undercover agents and informants all over the place in the movement. The second is that it was supposed to make it harder to prosecute white power violence in court, because then, if you take down one cell, you take down just these 6 people or these 2 people and not the whole movement. But I think the larger legacy of leaderless resistance is that white power has managed to obscure itself as a social movement. Mm-hmm. And we're left with this series of disconnected actions where there should be a through line and a story.
Right. So one of the big reasons you think that we sometimes fail to appreciate the coherence of the movement is that as a tactical matter, they have designed it to make it hard to see the coherence, to make it hard to see the connections among the groups that constitute it.
Yes, exactly. And that's what's happening in McVeigh's statement that he acted alone. I think he is embodying the strategy of leaderless resistance there.
Mm-hmm. So as for his own connection to the war, in this case, the Persian Gulf War, I doubt we've covered like all of the respects in which you think there is a connection between war and the white power movement, and maybe extremist movements in general. I don't know. But do you want to say more just to make sure we understand the different ways you mean? I mean, one thing, the most obvious is people go to war, they become familiar with weapons, they sometimes come back kind of messed up, right? That's one thing that happens. Mm-hmm. But there are other connections you see, right?
Yeah, I think the importance of the Vietnam War did several different things for this movement. First of all, it created that story that brought people together across different belief systems. That was really important, and that was made possible by the narrative.
They sent us there, they didn't let us win it, they don't appreciate us when we come back.
Yeah.
That kind of anti-government story.
Yeah. By contrast, Klansmen and neo-Nazis who had fought in World War II were not able to get in the same room until the Vietnam War because there wasn't that sense of betrayal. Mm-hmm. Another thing that the Vietnam War did was to provide a very material, it provided the material and infrastructure for the kind of violence that would be carried out. And you see this in groups like the White Patriot Party in North Carolina, where they were actually obtaining stolen military weapons from Fort Bragg, which is the nearest army post, and training with actual stolen military weapons and material. That's literally using the technologies of the Vietnam War at home. That's a very literal version of it, but we see that with uniforms, with symbols, with rhetoric, even with things like calling, using racial slurs for communist guerrillas in Southern Africa that had been used for Vietnamese combatants in Vietnam. Mm-hmm. But I think also it's about this imaginary of the Vietnam War, this narrative frame of activism. The Vietnam War is what set the parameters for what people thought would be feasible and possible for how people could envision a response to what they saw as a militant superstate in the 80s and the 90s.
Mm-hmm. I mentioned that sometimes people come back from war kind of messed up. And we've alluded to there are various ways people can get messed up. Timothy McVeigh's mother left him when he was young, and who knows? There's another guy you mentioned, David Lane, who you say was kind of famously sexually frustrated. There's a lot of different ways that people can get messed up psychologically. Do you have a view on kind of what the connection is? I mean, people are sometimes reluctant to emphasize that theme because they think it'll be taken to absolve people of responsibility, or it'll be taken to distract from what is, in fact, an ideological coherence among the people who constitute the movement. I've never really thought there was a contradiction there. I mean, there can be an ideological coherent movement that draws disproportionately on messed up people, but do you have a view on the kinds of psychological forces that, in a generic sense, that draw these people into these movements?
I think it really varies a lot. I think, well, and I should say only in a few places do I have enough archival depth on any person to even begin to see that kind of information. I'm not a psychologist. I don't have sources that really let me go, there. I have people who speak about their war experience in the language of PTSD as we would understand it from that period. But whether that is done in a performative way or a genuine way is really difficult to say, because that was also a very popular way of sort of referencing your war experience in a way that would appeal to other people. And when people speak about it, it's usually in the context of recruitment. Mm-hmm. It's difficult to say. On the other hand, I mean, there's some evidence that I believe Beam writes that he's diagnosed with PTSD. He also, rumor is that he withdrew from the movement because of the effects of Agent Orange poisoning. So he's an example of kind of the embodied Vietnam War taking him out of the movement too.
Of course, that would be a convenient narrative for people who stay in the movement, right? It's like, not only do we have an innocent explanation of why he deserted us, but we can blame Vietnam for this too.
Yeah, and I mean, like, I think that there's been some work by psychologists and ethnographers about what draws individuals to this kind of activism. Mm-hmm. My sense is that there's actually a lot of different kinds of people in this movement, and that was one of the things that I found really surprising in the archive. I found people with advanced degrees. I found physicists. I found rocket people. There were, of course, sort of like, I think the stereotypical person you might imagine in a movement like this is sort of an uneducated felon. There are some uneducated felons who drop out of high school and join the movement directly out of prison. Mm-hmm. There are a lot of different kinds of people who wind up in this for different kinds of reasons. And some of them are trying to get out, right? Some of them turn state's witness, testify against fellow group members. Some of the women testify against their husbands. It's really interesting. There's all kinds of splits and breakages. So my take on that is probably, so as I'm speaking to you, I sound like a historian rather than a psychologist, which is, there's a lot of sort of historical push and pull factors. And I might not have enough to sort of generalize about state of mind. I will say this. I think that this movement tells us something bigger about the American mind in the 1990s, which is there's this moment at the end of the Cold War where a lot of people had believed in imminent apocalypse and had feared the imminent end of the world. There's this moment when the Berlin Wall falls and the enemy disappears, right? Mm-hmm. And then there's this untethered story where people still believe in the end of the world, but the mechanism has vanished. The enemy is gone. And I think that there's this big moment of grasping around and sort of very deeply felt turmoil from people who aren't sure where the danger is located. And I think for a lot of people that I look at, the danger is the state, but I don't think that that's true only on the right. And in fact, one thing that you find when you look at these materials is that there are ways that, the radical right, as we think of it, has more in common with the radical left by the end of the 1990s than it does with the center. So Louis Beam ends up being a fan of the WTO protests in Seattle by 1999.
To him, the WTO is part of the New World Order, right?
Exactly. Right. So for different reasons, but it's like an enemy. So there's a lot of anti-statism on both sides of the political spectrum. Mm-hmm. I think actually brings those ends of the continuum together in some interesting ways across the 90s.
Well, maybe I shouldn't even ask this question, given the fact that you're understandably reluctant to speculate about things that go beyond your discipline of history, but I assume you've just, in a casual way, had occasion to reflect on parallels or lack thereof between these kinds of extremists and the Islamist extremists we hear so much about these days? You have people drawn into a movement with violent aspirations. Mm-hmm. Some of them have certain kinds of histories. People speculate about what does it and blah, blah, blah. And again, there's a number of different kinds of, it's not, different movements associated with it. And there's, kind of degrees of connection that different institutions or may have and ways people get drawn in and so on. Are there any comparisons you've come to?
Yeah. I mean, one thing that's interesting is just how acts of violence by each of those groups are reported. So we seem to have a predisposition in our journalistic coverage towards immediately personalizing and depoliticizing and disconnecting acts of white power violence. Whereas there seems to be a larger, looser category called something like ISIS affiliated or ISIS style extremism. I see a lot of affiliated, which I assume means that people can't actually tie the actor to the group directly, but that they're making some assumptions that often prove to be correct. I think that we might correct that division, possibly from both sides.
You mean with Islamist extremism, we are inclined to see it as this one big thing and connect to people to it fairly readily, whereas on the home front, it's like, well, that's militia. It's not really KKK, and that's skinhead. It's not neo-Nazi per se or whatever. But
and not only that, but when we face an act of violence, the first impulse when it is white power violence is often to portray it as the act of a madman or the act of a lone actor, right? Like lone wolf violence comes from this movement. But it often is part of an ideologically driven, connected social movement. So I think that has ramifications for how we think about reporting on it, how we think about juror education and prosecutorial strategy. I think it has implications also for just very simply how we think about it, how we think about the history of these actions.
Now that's interesting because thinking about, modern Islamist extremist terrorism, or whatever you want to call it, when you look at an individual actor who's done something violent there, and you start looking for individual causes, like you might say, well, he had been marginalized, he didn't feel at home, he wasn't fitting into America. You tend to get a lot of blowback from people who say, are you absolving him from first one? No, it's this movement, it's the belief, it's this that he was subscribing to. Whereas, as I recall with Timothy McVeigh, the whole thing was, what made this crazy guy do this thing? I mean, where in his past can we find the thing that pushed him over the edge? And that is a different explanatory approach. I may be exaggerating the difference, but that's the kind of thing you're.
I mean, I think you're right about that. One piece of evidence there is that, they were looking for a Middle Eastern gunman or a bomber for the Oklahoma City bombing before they lucked into a arrest of McVeigh.
In fact, what year was that? Wasn't
95 was the bombing.
Yeah. In fact, I remember people immediately inferring, as it happens, I was at the New Republic at that point, and I remember, I won't mention names, but there were people who leapt to the conclusion that was Muslims had done it.
Yeah, well, there's all kinds of reasons, there's all kinds of historical contextual reasons that people might think that, coming right after the First World Trade Center bombing. I think the Unabomber had not been arrested yet. I don't know.
Unabomber was probably 95 itself. I'm not sure, but I'm not sure. But
so before getting some familiarity with that, there wasn't really a model for this. So there's, it's really interesting. As a historian, it's really interesting the different ways that our the history of the nation as a white supremacist place still shapes us in a moment that we think of as no longer a white supremacist moment, more or less. I think that one of the things that this story shows is that a lot of people on the left and the right had this notion that we were living in a time when, the American race problem had been solved. So conservatives, colorblind conservatism that, did a lot of things that allowed a lot of people into the Republican Party who were Black and Latino, who believed that it was a colorblind party. It took Reagan at his word, right? Meanwhile, on the left, there were ideas about the post-racial, there were ideas about multicultural America. And then in 2016, this all came sort of flooding back into the mainstream, right? I think that this book shows us where overt racism and racial violence went in that interim period. And I think the history can really show us a lot about what we can learn from that moment.
Okay. And I guess if we want to close on a positive note, you had said earlier that if you're wondering what did these guys plan to accomplish with so relatively few people owning some guns and bombs, how did they plan to overthrow the government? The plan was that once they did some big dramatic show of violence, all these white people would rally to their side and say, oh, you're right, we hadn't realized how repressed we were.
Yeah.
Roughly the opposite happened after Oklahoma City, right? They were wrong.
Yeah, somewhat. So what happens after Oklahoma City is, on the one hand, there's a moment of public understanding and a series of government actions that kind of tamp things down, even as there's a surge in copycat violence. On the other hand, what the movement did...
Was there much copycat violence? Was just kind of small scale?
Little ones. No. Very small.
Okay.
Ones. Small, disorganized copycat actions. There's an upsurge in activity, but, small.
From people already in the movement, presumably, who said, okay, this is our way, this is our...
Yeah, I think you can think about the Olympics bombing as related in that way.
In Atlanta.
But in any case, there's a little spurt of copycat activity after the bombing, but there is a whole bunch of sort of dissuading factor from government crackdown and public backlash, right? But then after the trial, when there isn't a coherent narrative of what the bombing meant, right? We never got the narrative of this is what this was. I think it just left open the space for this movement to regroup and reemerge, which it has done quite successfully several times before. And I think that, they were, as I mentioned, very adept at using the internet. So you see Stormfront, the first big website, come up right after the bombing. And then, of course, a proliferation of white power websites. A lot of the movement relocated online. And so all of this was rolling and active. And, again, the fact that Dylan Roof was wearing that Rhodesia patch shows that there is a clear through line from then to now. It didn't go away and resurface. It went underground and resurfaced. So I think we have to think of this as a movement with many decades of organizing behind it, with coherent ideologies, even though they are reprehensible to me. They do have a worldview. They do have a series of goals and reasons for their actions, and they are things we can understand and learn from the past so that we can do better.
Okay. And now I know you're reluctant to talk about the present because you haven't studied systematically. Your thesis is, as you just said, with this movement in particular, there tends to be more than meets the eye, and there tends to be more in the way of historical continuity than is evident. So, well, anyway, congratulations on the book, Bring the War Home.
Thank you.
The White Power Movement, Paramilitary America, available everywhere. Do you have any online stuff you want to do? Have a Twitter feed you want to mention, or? Oh,
sure. Yeah, it's at Kathleen_Belew, or I have a website, KathleenBelew.com, which is KathleenBelew.com.
Okay, great. Well, thanks a lot for taking the time.
Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, bye-bye.